all these claims are commodified: grass-fed, natural, pasture-raised, free-range, cage-free. We're driving consumer focus onto the wrong things, having the wrong conversations. We're trading off the values that are represented by Nuance. And so that's the place where we're operating. And we're trying to figure out how on earth do we ever get credit for all of this work. We definitely have chicken on the shelf where it's twice as expensive as something next to it. And it looks inferior based off of claims. But on Nuance, it's superior on 1,000 different measures. What an interesting place to be trying to think about how do we disrupt this commodity industry where consumers have been indoctrinated into this system and trained to act in a way that is actually counter to their own desires and interests.
You guys are in effect turning the brand into the label. Like, we're earning this credibility by the choices we're making that are difficult, but over a long enough period of time, we feel like we can build that trust.
A lot of this conversation has been around spreading the right education and unveiling the curtain. How would they react knowing that the meat that they think was harvested in the U.S. and really raised some offshore country overseas, and they're essentially being deceived by the companies that they're buying their meat from?
Robby, welcome back to the Meat Mafia podcast, brother.
Thanks for having me back. Looking forward to
round 2, baby.
Whatever we get into, getting our hands dirty.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing. We were saying before, it's amazing how quickly time passes because we're over 400 episodes and you were episode 140, which was back in 2023. Is that amazing?
It's been a minute.
Yeah. And we were saying that because Force of Nature, you guys are you've been around for 6.5 years. And when we had you on the podcast, it was about 3 years that you had been in business pioneering this regenerative meat company and building brand new supply chains at scale. And so now, I mean, it's 3 years since then, the company has just evolved so much. So, and just politically, a lot of things have evolved too. So I feel like it'll be a pretty cool timestamp for a conversation.
Yeah, within the business, within the industry, within the retail and consumer environment, and certainly on a on the political, but I would call it more like on the regulatory side of things. And yeah, we launched technically in January of 19, and we did the last podcast in January of 23.
Yes,
we were really, that was like when the articles were filed, so there wasn't a whole lot like of actual business going on until much later in the year, 19. So we were basically had 3 years under our belt, and we had just, it's also funny to think about what we were just emerging from, 3 years of absolute chaos in the world.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Not that it hasn't been chaotic in the last in the few years since.
It's still trending in that direction.
But man, there's nothing like building a business forged in a crucible.
Especially in the space where you guys are really the tip of the spear of innovating in a space that I think a lot of people are looking at as this hopeful space for the future of the health of the U.S. You guys just really pioneering the regenerative ag space at scale. I'm so curious to just learn kind of like what the last 3 years have felt like, just, being in the regenerative space and then seeing all this momentum move through the health and wellness space the last few years.
Yeah, I think it's so funny too, because, I think we are at the tip of the spear in many respects, but also, again, we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And there's so many good actors in the space. And I think to your point, I think if we're doing anything that's been truly tip of the spear and unique, it's as you said, trying to figure out how to build a supply chain at scale that connects producers and consumers around a set of values that are contributing to, doing more good in the world. And there's been plenty of farmers and ranchers out there, practicing regenerative or very, other high attribute forms of agriculture before we came around. But I think as we talked about in the initial episode, we're just trying to, we recognize that these supply chains existed, but they could scale faster than demand was. And so we were, our whole objective was, how can we accelerate demand generation and create a pool from the consumer side that justifies more rapid scaling and expansion in the space. And I think it's pretty crazy to see the number of entrants into the category and to see the folks who've been doing it longer than us have the opportunity to grow. And I really do feel like we've contributed meaningfully to that very effort, helping to build that awareness and then facilitate and create demand and then facilitate connections between the supply chain and aggregating more and more and more producers who either are changing their practices or already were doing it. But, this is a stable form and security and opportunity for them to create a connection to those consumers. And so it's like, it's just a weird thing to feel like I don't want to take credit for what so many other people that aren't even directly related to us, but I do feel like we've had a serious role, and so it's really exciting to see the change. I think that was a qualification, right? But your question was around like what has evolved broadly from a messaging and climate and geopolitical and all the rest of it.
Yeah, just your guys' experience being in the regenerative space and just seeing. Really, like it seems like this groundswell of bottom-up momentum where it's like we need to make this change around health in general, and regenerative being a small but potentially way bigger piece of that. Just have you guys experienced that same growth as like I think other health and wellness brands in the space and health and wellness companies have?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was funny listening back to the last episode because we talked about what concepts or theories and seeing so much of that come to fruition and play out in practice. But this is the information age, and I feel like historically consumers have had the wool pulled over their eyes or have been willfully misled on some concepts. And I think seeing the villainization of fats and the villainization of meat at large, and attempts that would have probably historically been accepted and run with, like, hey, Fruit Loops are healthier than meat, right? I mean, like, that gets published with the greatest of authority behind it, and is widely mocked and got zero traction, and that probably wouldn't have happened historically. So I think consumers are educated, and I think there's a healthier level of skepticism. And it's not to say denialism as much as it is like trust but verify. And also, like I feel as a consumer, feel empowered to exercise my own critical thinking and common sense when I'm told something that just is very clearly gaslighting me and expecting some level of cognitive bias to gain any traction. And so, I think that there's been this evolution of consumers where as there's more transparency and there's more access to information, it's harder to bullshit. It's harder to take advantage of them. And I've said for years that, and I think in meat, you look at the trends in the various claims in premium meat, whether it's antibiotic free or grass fed or pasture raised or whatever it may be, depending on the arena, you can see the growth in those dramatically outseeding the category. And it's like, okay, it's very clear what consumers are signaling with their behavior. They want better. And the system, I think historically, has looked at that and said, okay, how do we take advantage of this momentum by minimum effort? Like what's the least I can possibly do to satisfy the consumer, whether it be legitimate or sufficient or not, and now I think that that's like the shortcut. And again, going back to just the deception that might be applied there, way more difficult to pull off. And then again, like also way more alternatives. There's a report issued by Rodale Institute, and it's old. It needs to be updated. It'd be fun to work with them to update it. It's from like 2017. So by the time a new issue came out, it'd be about 10 years. And it was like the state of grass fed. And I think one of the things it said in there is between like 99 and 2017, grass fed farming operations went from like 100 to like 3,000. And I bet you we've probably seen just as much incremental growth in the last 5 years, or last 10 years, excuse me. I think that's certainly backweighted, more recent growth than not. And so I think again, more people getting into the market, talking about these issues, creating more momentum, more awareness in consumers. So I think all of that has contributed to the further education and enlightenment of a consumer base where, yeah, authenticity, legitimacy, follow through matters. And I think another way of saying that is like nuance is starting to matter more. And I feel like this is a space, commodities in general, and we talk, and again, I'll stop referencing every everything we talked about on the last podcast, and folks should listen to it because we were all agreeing.
We'll link to
I re-listened
it.
to it, and I was like, man, that was good. I can't believe that was 3 years ago. But, oh shoot, I forgot the point I was trying to make on that one note. But, again, I just think getting back to the main question, I think it's more difficult to pull the wool over people's eyes, and I think that's generally a good thing. I was talking about claims in general and nuance, and I feel like that's where this whole conversation needs to go into the nuance. I think I've even had somewhat of an evolution in my understanding of regenerative and my positions on it, and I feel like that extends to claims at large. And I think I'm recognizing, as I said, and this is probably where I was going, I've often called commodification the focus on price above all else at the expense of all else. And the result of that as a single myopic point of focus is a cheapening of the food system and trading off value for price reduction. And I think we're seeing consumers come back and say like, hey, wait a minute, this is conceptually, we appreciate more affordable product, but all else remaining equal, all else doesn't remain equal, and I don't want to see my own health, or on certain issues, the health of the land, or the health of animals, or the health of communities of farmers and food producers suffer to the extent that they clearly are, in exchange for a few pennies.
Definitely.
Or as we also talked about, like to see massive costs deferred to the future that are probably disproportionately greater than the cost I'm saving today. So anyway, we can get into some of like what claims and regenerative and so on, but yeah, I think there's so many tailwinds, and it's so exciting, and there's so many good people out, and folks like you guys, and even more people helping to spread the word at the same time. Like we also have these other headwinds. Like, man, it's getting expensive out there, and costs are going up, and then there's other things that are taking place macroeconomically and geopolitically that are impacting that, and probably not to the degree people think, but certainly to a degree, and so it's exciting to see demand skyrocketing. It's frustrating to see costs also skyrocketing, and we want to drive more, not just awareness but accessibility, and that makes some of that more challenging. And so it keeps us on our toes.
Yeah,
a lot of nuance for sure. One of the things I was going to ask you, Robby, I was thinking about our last conversation, and I feel like one of the sticking points of that conversation, Harry and I were talking about, like what force of nature had meant to us at that point in 2023. And we were saying that you guys are really a point of verification for us, because there were so many grocery stores, and there still are, where, you're trying to get good quality meat, whether it be beef, bison, chicken, whatever it is. And you might go to the butcher counter, the person that's working at the butcher counter, and they can't tell you, the farm that it's coming from. Maybe they could tell you the state. They definitely can't tell you if it's grass finished or regenerative. So like seeing that force of nature freezer section at the Whole Foods in East Austin is like, it's this great verification source for us, where we say, hey, if we want grass finished and regenerative, we can get that. And I would say that I've been starting to see more grass finished or regenerative brands emerging at the grocery store, which is incredible. And I'm curious for you, when you think about, the future of the butcher section at the grocery store in 5 years, do you think there will be many more regenerative options available? Like, do you think that demand will continue to drive more regenerative options at the grocery store?
Do you mean particularly in the meat arena?
Yes.
I mean, because I think the answer is yes, through the whole grocery store. I think that there will continue to be more a growth in the number of producers out there, or ranchers, farmers, as people might think of them, moving in this direction, which would be good for everybody. And as we've said, we want to see regenerative scaling to be 10% of the supply chain in the U.S., which would, or globally actually. But that would make regenerative 10 times larger,
Yeah.
or more,
Yeah.
than it is today. So yeah, I think there'll be, but like as far as selection in the grocery store, I doubt retailers, because of how they operate, will want to have a proliferation of options on the shelf. They consider, shelf space is extremely precious to them, and so they're only going to have so many options that are consistent. And so there might be new names and new brands pop up, but I doubt that we go from one grass-fed option to 20 grass-fed options. It's probably more like, let's try a different. What are they have? They're going to have different value propositions.
Yeah.
And so and it kind of goes back to my prior point on regenerative. Not all practices are the same. Not all definitions and views and perspectives on regenerative are the same. But you might see, different brands at different price points, or different fat to lean ratios, a 93/7 and 80/20. You might see an organic, a grass-fed. You might start to see grocers testing different value propositions, but I don't think that we're going to have 20 of the same option. Does that make sense?
It does.
And then you can expand that to, I think where we've launched and focused initially is in the, raw form, whether it be fresh or frozen. But then there's cooked, and there's prepared, and there's sausages and breakfast, and there's all the different occasions and platforms and things. And I think you'll start to see proliferation into those. If you look at in the natural industry, if you look for dinner sausages, they're like all chicken.
Yeah.
It's not the same case in conventional. But we all know the challenge with monogastrics and chicken in particular. Not pork and chicken. And so there's an opportunity to clean those up quite a bit. And so once again, we're down into some nuance, but I do think we'll continue to see more options available to consumers in a variety of ways, but not necessarily as literally as you described it, as a proliferation of sameness, if that makes sense.
Got it. How long have you guys been doing chicken for?
Well, we just relaunched chicken in a couple months ago, and that was the first time we've done chicken in a couple of years. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we can dig into. And we actually launched our own podcast this same week to explain. Took Katie and Taylor and I an hour and a half to talk through the high level short version of the details. But yeah, I can get into an even more brief version here for sure.
Yeah, because we eat so much chicken in the United States, so this would be a cool topic to talk about.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that by 2030, I think chicken's supposed to represent like 30% of all American protein intake. That number might have shifted. I think it's maybe a few years old, but it's curious to me because I think it's an animal that Brett and I we were talking about this before the show, that we wrote an article around how chicken has changed through the years, over the decades, and the Chicken of Tomorrow contest back in the 50s, I think it was, basically made it so that we were breeding these chickens just purely for one reason and one reason only, and it really commoditized the genetics and the whole process of getting chicken from farms to tables, and made it really industrial. So I'm just super curious, like how you guys even approach entering into this space with the way that you guys think around regenerative.
I think it goes back to our kind of first principles thinking, like why would we get into chicken? And it's like, on the business side, it's like, hey, that's on a macro basis, 30% by 2030, that's interesting. I actually would have thought it was more, candidly. You think, we eat 87% of the beef we did a generation ago. We eat 350% of the chicken, so clearly, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. And we're eating more chicken, so there's an opportunity there. But we haven't done it. We didn't launch on it because it's the dirty bird. And really, in some ways, part of that evolution is like the original plant-based. It's like what plant-based modeled their launch strategy on. Villainize beef, position yourself as healthier and better for the environment. And better for the animal, when none of which are true, even remotely so. Chicken is definitely worse for the environment, definitely worse for the animal, definitely worse for the consumer. But it doesn't matter because we'll just tell them it is, and we'll get the benefit of the doubt because that's how the system historically worked. And And so it's like there's this huge opportunity, but there's just no entry point for us to get into this protein category that would meet our standards. And so, okay, logically, why? How do we find a way to get into it? Because like we also have this position in the space where we can lead change and be the first to do things or the first to lean into areas that others find really uncomfortable. So it's like, where can we do something that's important but nobody else is able or willing to do, and we're maybe uniquely capable. And I think in the chicken space, there's so many awesome folks out there doing the best they can in a part of the meat industry it's really difficult to succeed at. I mean, it is hard to make your ends meet in chicken because it has been so commodified, because it has gone from a symbol of prosperity, a chicken in every pot, as being said in the 1800s and being said by, I think, FDR, coming out of the Depression, and we celebrate with turkey, poultry, birds for like our most precious occasions.
Yes.
Like it's gone from that to the cheapest thing that there is for protein.
Yes. People are so price sensitive to chicken in
for
particular.
for a variety of reasons. And so it's very difficult to make the necessary improvements, even if you want to make them, because you're immediately priced out of the market. You go to certain retailers and you can get a fully rotisserie cooked bird at the point of purchase because it can be an impulse buy because it's so cheap at like $5 or $6, and we're selling frozen chickens for over $30. Like that's a non-starter for a lot of people. And if you literally are relying on this for your livelihood, you're just not going to be able to make those commitments and adjustments and still be in existence. And so I think for us, it's a really long way of saying, okay, the only way that we're going to do this is if we can actually go in and do something nobody else is doing and be proud of the change. And I think, again, a lot of folks are doing really cool things on farm, getting chickens out of barns, having fewer chickens, work with different feed types and rations, in terms of like corn-free, soy-free, organic, but still, like, these are really small footprints, and there's really massive off-farm impact. It's often reported that the impact off-farm is 40 times greater than on-farm, and almost all of the focus is on-farm with monogastrics. And so for us, it was
that's from an environmental standpoint. You're saying
yes,
okay,
yeah, from a land impact. There's a lot of land impacted by chemical industrial agriculture or just industrial agriculture to produce the feed that then gets milled and sorted and processed and shipped, and logistics to get it to a farm to feed those birds. Way bigger than what's going on the farm. So as beautiful as the farm is, everything going off the farm can't be ignored. We can't just have willful or ignorance. And again, there's a lot of good people that would prefer to have better options to support their own on-farm system with better off-farm options, but they're not in a position or have the capacity to address that. And it's like, well, no, if we're going to do this, that's where we're going to focus.
Yeah,
we're going to get a player on the field. We're going to participate in the game so that we have a stake that gives us the credibility to have a voice. Like our opinion doesn't matter if we're not on the field. Now we have the right to an opinion, an informed one. And then we have a foothold from which to build on to go in and attack that. And so I'm being way too long-winded on this. I'll just get into the details. So we launched Poultry a handful of years ago with a single supplier that was really working on some of these same things. Better living conditions for the bird, a better breed of bird that would be conducive to thriving from a welfare and from a eating quality and nutrition perspective in those systems, and better feed to support them. And that operation went out of business. We had all our eggs in that basket, and therefore we stopped offering the product, and there wasn't an alternative that met our standards to work with. So we spent the last couple of years trying to literally sending the team around and interviewing dozens of different poultry growers and simultaneously building our own protocol and then contracting them to say, hey, you do really great stuff with your own programs, but we're going to try to do something that raises the bar beyond what anybody's comfortable with. And we're going to create our own protocol and then contract you to grow against that. And then, we've eventually selected 4 different growers east, west, north, and south, to build our, we're a little bit diversified. We have some seasonality, we have different stuff, and we get to explore and experiment more. But it's all ultimately the same protocol where we're focusing on, from a farmer and from a consumer perspective, how do we make sure we have the best impact on the farm? How do we make sure we have the best welfare for the bird? How do we make sure we deliver the best product for the consumer? And how do we begin to have the best impact off of the farm, particularly in the feed supply? So our protocol, and again, what is a protocol? It's like a criteria. It's like a set of standards that says, like, these are all of our non-negotiables, and it goes through a variety of different criteria. So we say, like, hey, you can't ever use a Cornish Cross bird. To your point about the chicken of the future and the industrialization, like, that bird, living sentient animal, respect it to death, but it is not a bird that is biologically engineered to thrive in any condition, certainly not in the conditions that we want, which is birds outside on pasture having a symbiotic relationship with the land that they're on. That is also a bird that is engineered to thrive on industrial corn and soy, and we want to find alternatives to that. It's also a bird that's, engineered to be chronically ill and generate disproportionately large breasts and not have proper organ or bone development, such that it can't live as long as a life cycle as we want. So we say no Cornish Cross. Heritage breeds birds where their genetics were optimized for things like health, flavor, nutrition, not cheapening a feed conversion. And so they better, again, they check boxes for us. They better fit our system. We don't sex chicks, so we're not, sexing of chicks is at 1 day old, animals on a conveyor belt. And, I either want all females or all males because I want perfectly homogeneous, perfect consistency, perfect predictability in my system to, again, drive costs down across the board. So if they're not the right species, they just roll off the end of the conveyor into a grinder and they get macerated, or they go into a gas chamber and get gassed, or, whatever inexpensive way we can kill 50% of all of the chickens that are hatching for convenience, naturally. And to us, that just seems like bullshit. So we have males and females, no sexing, on the ground together. Also, don't you think that birds should live in, if we're trying to, as best as possible, replicate nature, have both sexes represented for some obvious and maybe less obvious to all of us reasons. Again, reminding ourselves too that chicken are jungle fowl. They're descendants of Southeast Asian jungle fowl, and they're not cattle. So pasturing them as we would ruminant, grazing, migratory animals is not the same as a bird that probably would prefer to be in a tree or so like we have to give them some place to call home and get up off of the ground and be familiar. And so, we allow both fixed barns and mobile range coops, but we want to approximate something that's more evolutionarily appropriate for chickens. And so if you're in a fixed barn where, they go back inside of a building each day to stay safe from predation and elements and all of those things, they want that. That is a welfare issue if they don't have the ability to do that. That's why in the wild, you might think of turkeys going and roosting in the same tree every night. But, also we don't want to confine them to a barn where they're living in their own fields, shoulder to shoulder. They don't get sunlight. They have this, they're not roaming, scratching, doing the things chickens want to do. So we want them to go outside. But, if you just open the doors, they're likely not to go outside. All their food and water and protection's inside. So we require that they have sufficient food and water outside for them to roam, that there be planting schedules and protocols to make sure there's vegetation and bushes and things that both can help with cycling nitrogen, but also giving them something to eat and giving them shade and protection and safety. There needs to be structures out there for them to hide under for weather or for predation, et cetera. You have to pull them outside. They got to want to be out there. They want to thrive as well as we do, but you put them out on a patch of dirt and, they're just fodder for birds, death from above. And so we dictate that, but also in the mobile range coops. A lot of these mobile range cooping systems that, technically meet a definition of pasture, they're also confined, and we're like confinement free, so like the doors have to open. It's fine if you want to have a coop that moves as long as it has these elements. Also, the doors have to open, and also there has to be feed and water and things outside, again, for the same reason. We want them foraging. We want them ranging. And, I think the list goes on and on. I think a really interesting thing, the USDA says something like, maybe as much as or potentially more than 30% of the product in the market labeled as antibiotic free, as antibiotic is testing positive for antibiotic residue in the meat. Really interesting. Obviously the load or amount matters, but regardless, there is some of the properties of those antibiotics that get imparted into the meat are imparted into the consumer of the meat as if taking, a small amount of antibiotics. And I think, look, we can talk about antibiotic free versus subtherapeutic and all of these other things, but ultimately, if consumers are being told something's antibiotic free, it should be antibiotic free. And the way the system works is just signing an affidavit that says we didn't do it. And it turns out that there's dishonesty in the system such that a third of animals labeled in the market as antibiotic free have antibiotics. So what do? We test every flock. We take, trust but verify. And we send samples of meat off to labs to confirm that there's been no foul play at cost. Our birds live longer, which allows them to develop more properly. There's a welfare component to that. Also, it means that there's more nutrition imparted into the meat, better flavor. There's longer rest cycles between flocks so that the ground and the land can recover. And there's a list that just keeps going on and on. All this nuance we'll never convey on the front of the package. We limit chemical use in the raising, so it would technically meet the organic standard. In fact, we exceed the organic standard on antibiotics because I think organic allows you to treat eggs with antibiotics, but not after 1 day old, and we don't have any antibiotics. And again, the list goes on and on. And then we launched the program, and this is where things get really interesting. We were like, okay, great, yeah, we'll do all of this, and by the way, the claim that we do to try to make everybody happy, because as we've talked about before, everybody in the poultry industry, is very polarizing, and there's a lot of infighting and a lot of crabs in the bucket. And while we have more in common than not, folks, disagree on small things, and it's like, all out war. So we chose a claim that is not pasture-raised and not free range, because I think both of those are inappropriate and misrepresent what's proper for chickens. We chose a claim that is free to range with unrestricted access to pasture. I think it's more intuitive. I think it's more truthful. I think it cuts through semantic, legal, technical jargon bullshit. And I think it's just like, hey, these birds can range, which a lot of mobile range coop systems can't.
Yeah.
But they're also not on land 24/7 because they have a barn. And some of our growers have the barn that they might go back to. So that is unrestricted access to pasture, meaning they're allowed to go out on pasture whenever they want, so long as it's safe, as in during the day and during, when it's not, a blizzard or whatever. So
on that point, you guys are really, in that sense, mimicking, because the labeling stuff I think can be so confusing for the consumer. But what you guys have done was saying free to range and then also having access to go back into the barn. It's basically saying, hey, this is like what a chicken would do in nature. If they had a tree accessible to them, they would hop up in the tree. We give them just the freedom to live like a bird.
What a chicken would not do in nature is roam across a cropland or a pasture and live on the ground in a new location every day. That is not what a chicken would do. And there's ecosystem services provided by that, and there's I think there's coolness to it too. I'm not disparaging it. I'm just saying that's part of the challenge of all of this nuance. Like pasture raised as a claim has value in the eyes of a consumer because of the perception of it being better. In this context, it is applied to convey to the consumer this system is better, even if it's misapplied.
Yeah.
But like how am I going to re-educate a consumer on this? Let's just call it pasture raised and give ourselves a thumbs up for it. So again, I think there's benefit. I'm not going to disparage that. I just like, hey, I'm willing to work with mobile range coops as we do, but like I want to make sure that it's going to be appropriate for the chickens, and I want to make sure I want to have a confinement free operation. And they're and I think that's. I often try to think back to like, I don't care about what I can what's technically correct or we can get away with. I'm like, what are consumers expecting? What are consumers desiring, and how do we better deliver on that even when it's difficult to get credit for it?
Yeah.
And we're not perfect on that regard, but I think thinking about things from that perspective, keeps you honest.
Yes.
And Yeah, I'll leave it at that because I don't want to come across as belittling, what other folks are doing. But yeah, I just think like people. I think you want animals that are out on land and not in a cage, whatever shape and however that cage might move. Anyway, all of that to say, getting back to feed and the off-farm impact. And so like these are all things that we're doing that are massive and incremental, I think, maybe not individually, but collectively to what's consistent in the industry. And then off the farm, we wanted to be as regenerative as possible. And it turns out there's been a lot of, as regeneratives have grown, as we talked about in the past, there's a lot of different opinions on it. And there's a lot of certifications and there's a lot of greenwashing and there's a lot of things where like regenerative is not regenerative is not regenerative. And our definition of regenerative is very much different than a lot of other people's. I would say in the sense that we are drastically superior. And there's a lot of products on the shelf that are labeled as regenerative that we would not consider regenerative. And our current chicken product would absolutely qualify to be labeled as regenerative, I think probably by any certifying body, but we do not put regenerative on the label because we don't think that it's regenerative because we haven't fixed the off-farm net holistic end-to-end impact that it's having as far as the inputs of the animal and the life cycle. But the reason is like you go to feed and it was like, okay, we want feed that's coming from a regenerative system. It's like, what does that mean? Well, what are the 6 principles of regenerative agriculture? Obviously, we could cite those. I'm sure your consumers have some vaguely familiar, and we don't have time to go through all of them, but the first one is limit chemical and mechanical disturbance. So try not to till the hell out of the ground and destroy the environment and ecosystem and all the life on the land. And also don't engage in chemical warfare for the same reason. And spray herbicides to kill the plants and fungicides to kill the mycorrhizal networks and insecticides to kill all of the life that is in the invertebrate form and then fertilizers and all the rest of the things that go on and poison all of us and all of our waterways and lands and reservoirs and oceans and so on. And oh my goodness, it doesn't exist. You can find regenerative feed that is chemical free. And to do that, there is intensive tilling. And so, I can give you examples of where that's good and bad in the most extreme application. And as it turns out, with greater scale, the most extreme of the application. And, I've been to farms where you're an organic farm that are 40,000 acres in size. And it's been dozens of tractors have spent over a week tilling it. And the only thing left alive is, I don't know, nothing over like 50 something square miles.
Wow.
And all, that topsoil is going to erode away and, there's going to be challenges with it, but there's not chemicals being used. I'm not saying that sarcastically. I'm saying, there's not chemicals being used. And then the inverse is also true. There's examples of folks out there that are out there doing incredible work on no-till. But in order to do no-till, they're using massive amounts of chemicals. And there's sort of this like, zero sum. It's either or, pick your poison. And I'm like, there is a middle ground. It's just hard. So that's where we're going to go. But we can't let perfection be the enemy of progress. And to get this program off the ground, we have to start somewhere. In an ideal world, and we have a lot of work, and we may not be able to achieve it, and we got to think about like who we're building this program with. We can't pull the rug out from under them. We are committed to supporting farmers and ranchers, and supporting consumers, and walking a fine line because sometimes in championing and representing both, there's difficult nuance to navigate. So we got to build these systems and be thoughtful of the implications to everybody that is impacted meaningfully. But in getting it started, it was like, well, shoot, if we can't have our ideal, which is probably like corn and soy free, regenerative, no-till, cover crops, multi-species, obviously no chemical use, yada yada yada, which wasn't available that we could find at the scale. And by the way, when we have suppliers across the country getting where you got to grow this in multiple places. That's part of the big challenge of feed is not only you have to grow it in near proximity, but you got to mill it somewhere and you got to be able to supply it. And again, like it's just very, very, very complicated. what would be our minimum standard or our minimum bar? And it's like, I guess if I have to choose, I'm going to go back to that decision point. What's the consumer thinking? And like at a minimum, the consumer thinks that we're not poisoning them. So we chose organic feed to start. Because I want to make sure that when we put something on the plate for a consumer that I can say, we're not supporting a system that uses pervasive chemicals in order to put food on your plate. Also across our by the way, there's a lot of ways that chemicals can get into the feed. We all have chemicals in us. The three of us in this room are probably insane by common standards
Totally.
and what we go and do to try to avoid. But like, it's in our brain matter, it's in our blood, it's in our urine, it's in our, the breast milk of the women we love. And it's in the water systems, it's in the air, it's in, so there's only so many ways that you can limit exposure, but at least we're not going to put it on the food of our food.
Yes.
And so that's another claim that we've launched with is organic fed, which is really, which has been a whole different can of worms, like we're going back and forth with the USDA and on whether or not we can even say that on the front of package. They approved it, but then there's a bunch of different bodies and the bureaucracy, and it's going through channels, and some even of our large natural customers are like, you can't say that. And it's like, well, would you rather us not be organic fed? What incentives do we want? Do we want to offer something that's superior to the consumer and get credit for it, or not? And like, let's talk about, so I think we're innovating and disrupting. I think we are making great progress there. And I think the relevant parties involved are gonna find a path there, which could be really cool and open the door for other people to do the same thing. But also, like, our whole program, the problem is because the whole program isn't organic, and they're like, well, why not just make the whole program organic? And the reason for that is nothing would change about the program. The ability to scale the program would be hamstrung considerably, because you have to then do certifications and audits on farm and in processing facilities that would pass those certifications, but would have to do them at significant cost. And the product, therefore, would be in lower supply at a significantly higher cost on the shelf to consumers. So it's like, it would make marketing easier, but it would make the product less accessible, both from a supply and a cost perspective. It would make this protocol less available to support farmers and ranchers, and nothing whatsoever would change. There would be no value in outcomes or practices. So like, yeah, it's going to be harder to not do this, but this is the right thing to do. So we just went with organic fed out the gate.
Yeah.
That's kind of where the crux of the challenge with that where there's back and forth and people are like, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. Wait, but that makes sense. But we haven't thought about it, but nobody's done it, And so like, that's where we're working through it. But again, that's a starting point to then be like, okay, so now can we work with the regenerative? How do we go from more, chemical free to also limiting mechanical disturbance, and then incorporating more cover cropping, and then incorporating different feed mixes so we can do testing? Because, just taking corn and soy out of the diet can be a welfare issue for the birds too, and we got to find alternatives, and it has to be seasonal, and it has to be regional, and it has to be, it's hard and it's complicated. So it's not corn and soy free, and it's not regenerative, but that's the starting point. And we're literally building out and working with those certifiers to build out multi-year plans for what transition might look like, understanding that it isn't linear or predictable, and it'll be iterative, and it'll be learnings along the way. But like, the only reason we're doing poultry to begin with is to do that. So that's happening.
Yeah. Man, this might be one of the most nuanced topics we've ever covered on the show. But I like what you said too about like essentially like take perfection off the table. That's impossible. And we're going to continue to make iterations and make the best possible product that we can do for you as the consumer.
But that can be such a cop out. Don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. So we're going to compromise and dig our heels in. Let's be clear. Progress is the point of emphasis here. So there has to be a reasonable starting point. There has to be non-negotiables and a minimum bar, with that we will not go below. So it took us 2 years to build the system that established a minimum bar that we would not go below, which happens to be dramatically beyond where the industry is at today. But we don't start even here if we don't acknowledge that progress is required.
Yes.
And therefore, we can make certain compromises with the understanding that we are endeavoring towards progress on those, not simply justifying, let's get comfortable and never change. That's where most people go wrong.
Yeah. It is so easy to use that as a cop-out, so I appreciate you clarifying that. I guess my question for you is, because you said you had the one farm that went out of business, which was the single point of failure for you guys. Was there any part of you from a business standpoint where you, Taylor and Katie, just said, hey, we're a red meat company. People know us for our game as well. Like, do we really want to even continue chicken because it's so difficult? Or were you guys just like, no, we have to bulldoze and figure this thing out because consumers need this product?
That is exactly how our conversations have gone for years.
Like there was no option besides you guys getting back into the chicken game.
No, there was options of not getting into the chicken game. It's just like, this is so screwed up.
So hard. Yeah.
It's so bad and so difficult. And the gap in expectations, particularly around price, is so grand that it's insurmountable. And we need to focus, and there's so much other opportunity elsewhere. And, like maybe we shouldn't do it. Or we have to compromise on our values to find a starting point. Maybe we shouldn't do it. And, the other side of it is, again, and the reason we went for it ultimately is I think that we need to earn the right to have a voice in the space. And I think it's very important that we educate consumers about poultry. And I think that we really do have an opportunity, maybe even more so than in ruminants, to help enlighten consumers and raise awareness and raise standards and practices. And the only way we do that is by participating and then meaningfully provide alternatives and crack doors open that others can follow through. And we can bear the brunt of the risk. And we just have that role in that position. Like I said, do something difficult that nobody else, can do that's important and needs to be done. And I think this is a space where like we check those boxes. And so, I think this is like maybe not dissimilar from starting Force of Nature at all. I don't really want to do it, but we got to do it.
Yeah.
Not that I don't want to do it, but like it's hard. Starting businesses is risky. Most fail. We talked all these things we talked about, but like this is just like it's so important that it's worth all of the challenge to pursue it. And then we could go into all of the reasons why there's what we went into that decision. But
yeah, well, it's so cool hearing you talk about disruption because the problems that you guys are addressing are decades and decades and decades old of just issues that have built on top of each other within this space. And so for you guys to take them head on and just say, hey, we're going to disrupt here and come at it from like a practical standpoint of like knowing that the consumer has gotten used to this legacy industry that is, used to kind of, you talked about, feed and all the standards that have just lowered, quite frankly. And you guys are coming in and saying, hey, we're going to take our time on this and really make this a problem that we actually end up making an impact on solving, I think is, to your guys' credit, just incredibly admirable. I'm curious, like, what time scale do you guys think about solving this problem on?
Many years. Years. And like that's probably one of the biggest challenges is we haven't even scratched the surface on the nuance in this conversation, and yet everything we've talked about, it's extremely difficult to get credit for. It's like we're in a closet doing the right thing, doing hundreds of right things that will never show up on a label to a consumer for the benefit of that consumer, because I know it's what most or many of them are wanting, expecting, or hoping for. And so how the heck do you position yourself where, I always give this as an example. You guys have been to Rome Ranch, and we're talking about poultry here, so we'll just use turkey as an example. You've been to Rome Ranch. You've seen their turkeys. Have you been to turkey harvest?
I have not.
Been to bison harvest, not a turkey harvest.
Going
anyway,
this November.
Tangent. We're gonna try to pull. It'll be the one tangent I'd try to pull us back from instead of like diving into. But they have such an incredible poultry operation, doing really, really, really cool stuff, exceeding the industry standard on every measure, not at scale. But they have turkeys running with bison, eating incredible feed, living incredible lives out on the land. We could go on and on and on about how cool it is, up to and including the point where literally wild Rio Grande turkeys in Texas have volunteered into their flock and live with their turkeys because they're like, this is legit. This is like what a happy place. You know?
5-star hotel.
And then they're breeding their own turkeys and building this thing, and it's all heritage and all the stuff. And they do it because they have small community harvests at the end of the year. And if we were to take their turkeys and put it in a ground brick format, a 1 pound of ground turkey, and put no labels on it, and then go to a leading natural food grocer and take a pound in a brick form of their organic turkey and put it in an unlabeled package and offer those two choices to a consumer and say, hey, this one on the left is organic and it's like $6.99. And this one on the right is not organic and it is $15. What do they choose?
The non-organic one.
Every time.
Yeah.
They choose the organic one every time.
Oh, they choose the organic
Is it the
one.
price?
There's no, it's empty packages. All they see is $15 with a non-organic claim, or they choose organic for $6.99.
Yeah.
Now this is where you were going.
Yeah,
This is why we were not on
Got
the same
ahead of
page.
ourselves.
Now we pull the curtain back and we say, this organic turkey came from this factory farm where this turkey never saw outside. Everything was curated. It was this awful environment, all these breed issues, the antithesis of everything I just led off the call or this conversation talking about with chickens. Very much, I would just not just say not ideal, I would say kind of horrifying to the average consumer, but it's organic. And then here's Rome Ranch and Katie and Taylor and the dogs running around with the birds. Now, which one do you choose? They choose the $15 one every time because they're like, that is appalling. The organic is appalling. But like that can't convey. The way our system works, that'll never get conveyed on the shelf. That is the story of Nuance. And Nuance doesn't have space in a world where claims are commodified because organic is 100% a commodified claim. All these claims are commodified. Grass-fed, natural, on down the list. Pasture-raised, free-range, cage-free. And so like we're driving consumer focus onto the wrong things, having the wrong conversations. We're trading off the values that are represented by Nuance. And so like that's the place where we're operating. And we're trying to figure out how on earth do we ever get credit for all of this work when we are the brand out there. Fortunately, we've established Force of Nature and we have a loyal customer base and a following. And we're able to do more than offer a blank package that conveys there's something premium. But ultimately, like we definitely have chicken on the shelf where it's twice as expensive as something next to it. And it looks inferior based off of claims. But on Nuance, it's superior on 1,000 different measures.
Yeah.
What an interesting space to exist and what an interesting place to be trying to think about how do we disrupt this commodity industry where consumers have been indoctrinated into this system and trained to act in a way that is actually counter to their own desires and interests. And where very large, very scaled operators that are extremely industrialized can benefit at the expense of small regional farms and ranches that are doing really cool stuff that may not translate to a claim on a package.
Yeah. Well, I think in 2025, I don't know if this is a great answer, but it's probably leveraging conversations like this in social media at scale, right? Where you have the best opportunity to reach hundreds of thousands, if not millions of potential listeners that could be customers that really care about you guys unveiling the curtain and showing the differences in regards to how you're doing things versus these conventional greenwash brands that they're probably purchasing from at the grocery store, right? So you have a conversation like this on Rogan's podcast or some of these other big guys, it would be really interesting to see the ripple effects of that potentially. But that's just that was my immediate thought process.
No, it makes sense. And I mean, that's why, heck, we've doubled the size of our marketing team just this year alone.
Makes sense.
That's the most obvious.
Yeah.
That's the most obvious path to approach it. But, even still, that story is going to reach less than 1% of the population.
Yeah.
And there's a cost to it. And so we got to figure out how to reach more people without talking over their head or lecturing them with the right message and the right ways that they're consuming. And that ultimately ends up driving traffic. At the end of the day, we still have to reach the traffic at the store that we're not driving into the store. We got to talk to them at the shelf, and we got to find some way to think different. Like again, going back to why does it say free to range with unrestricted access to pasture on the package? Why does it say organic fed on the package? Why are we taking on those fights that are disproportionately difficult? And some people look at us like, why are you doing this? This is not, it's hard. Don't do that. And it's like, well, this is part of a much bigger thing, and it's an entry point. And like, should we be talking about organic on our package and paying? I mean, there's an example where, one of our, we had a part. I'm going to try not to be specific because some partners just don't like us talking about them. Some love us to talk about them and say their names. But I don't want to give too much away. But we have a partner that is in the ruminant side of the business, and they're like, hey, we looked at being organic. We have a 30,000 acre ranch, pretty big. The cost of certifying the ranch was going to be $90,000 a year. That ranch sends about 600 animals a year to slaughter, maybe 900, somewhere between 600 and 900 animals a year to slaughter. Do the math. What's $90,000 on 600 to 900 animals? Huge.
Significant.
Well, we're talking about dollars per pound translation to the consumer to have a certification that, again, wouldn't change their practices. What is organic? Organic is huge. It's important. It's a $60 billion industry. Consumers trust it. It tells them something important. This is better. They may not understand why, but they perceive it to be better and they're willing to support it, and that's important. I'd say most consumers think it means chemical free. So do we have to go through that to say, like, hey, we built a protocol that says that that we're, this is chemical free? Do we have to have a third party welfare certifier that may similarly drive no change in practice, but dollars to the consumer to get a third party to certify it to say that it is no feedlots ever?
So that ranching partner, Robby, so they would pay $90,000 for that certification
A year.
And there's nothing else that they would have to. They would literally just come out.
They would qualify. It's just they need.
It's just So there's nothing that would have to change.
No.
Man, it's a good
That's
racket.
so crazy. I would love to just be.
I don't want to call it a racket. Like I wouldn't. I don't want to misrepresent it, right? I mean, there's a role for that. These are milestones and importance, and I think there's a lot. Like I still go to the grocery store and buy organic produce and buy.
I do as
all
well.
else equal. Like
Yeah.
because you know why? Because I don't want them using chemical on my feed, and I think that there has to be, like, how the heck? I mean, it's a measure of objectivity. A certifying body says, like, yeah, I'll take your, I can take your word for it. And again, we end up with 30% of things saying antibiotic free have antibiotics in them.
Yes.
Because we're taking your word for it. It's an affidavit. I promise.
Mm-hmm.
Certification kind of addresses that. So, like, it makes sense. It is logical. The intention is not wrong, but I think the execution and the ultimate outcome actually can, in some cases, take us away, move us further away from the desired outcome. And I think there's alternatives, and I think that it's worth spending our time exploring those and doing the more challenging work of, like, hey, how do we live in the nuance and find an alternative that can be objective and can be, legitimate and doesn't necessarily open the door for flagrant fraud, but also drives more positive outcomes in supply chains and better serves producers and consumers and doesn't, make supply unavailable or price product out of the market where it's inaccessible for, folks in different socioeconomic classes.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. I would love to just be a fly on the wall at the Force of Nature boardroom office, just hearing you guys talk about, like, all right, we're putting a better quality product out there. We're taking some of these claims off this. This is a risk that we're taking. And just you guys basically saying, well, we're going to figure out a way to, like, still educate through this and improve the standards. Where you guys...
It's all, sorry
to
interrupt, but it's, like, also part of our thesis. Like,
yeah,
we built it from day one to be this, right?
Yeah.
To operate outside of the status quo and to say, we're going to be force of nature. We're going to aggregate. We're going to build these supply chains, and we're going to take on these issues. And you can trust us because we're going to give you transparency and have these conversations and dig into the nuance. And maybe in doing that, we can avoid having to go play the claims game and commodify ourselves and put ourselves in a position where we can't be as be the thought leader and make the changes that we want to make and be as progressive because our hands are tied based off of pricing ourselves out of the category. And then that can make sense in the context of force of nature, but how does that scale outside of force of nature? Again, there's a lot to think about, but that is, like, why we exist. And I think right now, part of what we're doing to address this is coming up with, like, our own standard and our own initiative around transparency, where we talk about, okay, well, how does on poultry, on beef, bison, etc., how does our programs stack up against animal welfare approved, certified humane, other top leading welfare? What about how do we stack up against organic, non-GMO, pasture-raised? How do we stack up against on down the list of each
Yeah.
of these, all of these pillars: feed, living environments, et cetera, and compare on a matrix basis, like what does our standard deliver on versus is it third party certified to do that? And the answer is ideally it will never be third party certified because that limits growth, scalability, access, and adds cost. But we want to be able to get credit and explain to consumers like, hey, look, it's fair to ask the question, why is it not organic? Let me explain what it is. It's better. It's better than on all these measures. And maybe it's not better than on every measure, but it's, in many instances it is. And so I think like doing things like that can be an alternative again to being forced into a system, like I said, that doesn't necessarily serve the best interests of the consumer or the producer.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about just the whole nature of labeling, because you guys are in effect turning the brand into the label, like where it's like, hey, we're building this, we're earning this credibility by the choices we're making that are difficult, but over a long enough period of time, we feel like we can build that trust.
Yeah, and we can say take our word for it to a certain extent, but that's not reasonable to expect that to convince every consumer, nor should it.
Yes.
We consumers should be giving more scrutiny, giving a lot more scrutiny to the industry, and it doesn't scale beyond us.
Yeah.
So how do we figure out how to do this in a way that, again, is authentic, is legitimate, does serve a more skeptical consumer, and also can be leveraged elsewhere beyond our own shores, such that it's not only about us.
Yeah, that's kind of the key.
Robby, what are a lot of your relationships like with your ranching partners that you guys source from? The reason why I ask that is, Harry and I have interviewed so many ranchers, and it seems like so many of them are literally dying just for distribution. And so I'm just curious, like with the work that you guys are doing and to really support them and get their products out there at scale, what are a lot of those relationships like? And I'm sure they're all different too, but.
It's a weird question. I mean, there's such a big spectrum. I mean, generally, you have to understand that like our process for working with a rancher, there's a lot of companies out there, and again, not to disparage anybody, the most well-meaning companies who don't appreciate all of the nuance, that will say like, okay, it needs to be regenerative and grass-fed and pasture-raised, maybe. If you guys were going to launch a meat bar, I don't know, whatever. You guys are going to do jerky, that'd be where you would probably start. You'd be like, what do we do? Okay, well, get somebody that has these certifications, or we'll sign these affidavits and go on. And I think what we figured out is that like paperwork is pretty cheap, and certainly imperfect. And so we require a lot more paperwork. And again, our protocols and expectations and standards are a starting point that is very robust. And then we go do audits ourselves. We go meet people, explore, learn their why, understand, make sure we're like-minded, make sure they're in it for the right reasons. Is this a transactional relationship? Do they want to raise the bar every year? Are they excited and passionate or not? So, like, generally when we're at the point where we're working with somebody, there's been a thorough mutual vetting. We send team members out. We do monthly calls. We do annual calls. I mean, we're managing the relationship, the expectations. It's a roller coaster, and we're in it together. And communication and values alignment and long-term thinking is really important to that. I think some of our suppliers are like, hey, we're already doing all this stuff. We're happy to sell to you, and that's great. And you're a reliable customer for us. And we can scale with you. That's stability. Some folks are like, hey, and there's a lot of people that they have their own brand. They do they do e-com, D2C. They do retail. They do, there's folks like that we work with. We're buying your boxes. There's other folks that we work with where they're selling us whole animals, and they're like, yeah, actually, I don't even want to get on a video call. I have a flip phone, and anything that takes me out of the pasture with my animals and requires me to interact with human beings is undesirable for me. So
so it's a wide spectrum.
Yeah. And some folks where actually they're going into them, like I described in the chicken program, we're asking them to change their practices. And there's some folks where they're at scale and they're like, hey, look, I know you qualify as grass-fed, but this feed cake ration that you're using in the winter months has a binder in it that is actually grain-based, and so we're going to need you to change that. And nobody else would ask you to do that, but and they're, so like it's varying degrees. There's people that exist that we're a cornerstone for, and there's people that exist completely fine without us. But I think generally that most folks are, again, values aligned, and they recognize the role that we're playing. We're not putting on a cape and saving every single person that we work with. And at the same time, I think we are an important part of a large body of good actors who are helping do what we talked about before, raising awareness and accelerating demand and improving access, both for suppliers to consumers and for consumers to suppliers, in a way that creates demand signals and rewards both ends of the supply chain and both sets of front lines. And so I think that, we have had suppliers that we've worked with for years that have no longer been suppliers for us, and we're bringing on new suppliers every year. And, I think by and large, we've had extremely long-standing positive relationships with our supplier network. So I'd say that's a good sign.
Yeah.
And for those that we're not working with, it's probably because they're so healthy that the situation has emerged that they can evolve. And it's like, hey, this is awesome. We're still best friends. And in some instances, it hasn't been that because there's been differences of opinions. But I think I would shortly describe that as like all our relationships are positive, and we're playing an important role for most of our suppliers. And we're not even talking about processors. And almost all of the same things can be said for processors, of which I think that we have 10 or so different slaughter facilities or further processing facilities spread across the country where the same sets of issues exist. They need meat or animals or pounds to work with. They need to continue to exist to serve their community. And I think that we've grown and helped them improve and been a cornerstone and have positive relationships with them. Most we still work with, some we don't. We add more every year. So I don't know. It's an interesting question to think about. Like when I get on the phone call with our suppliers, we're all smiling and laughing and having a good time.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Do you see any disparity between U.S. suppliers and foreign suppliers that you guys use, like just in terms of quality and expectations around standards?
Oh, it's super interesting. So just for clarification, venison and elk in our supply chain comes from New Zealand. And so that would be an example of an international supplier. They have a very mature industry there, and the standards and practices dramatically exceed anything that we could find domestically. There's just not really a domestic supply chain of venison and elk that's that would meet our standards. And there's a bunch of reasons we even got into venison and elk, but that's where those are coming from. And that network is really interesting. Probably 70% of our venison and elk supply is farmed, and 30% is actually wild harvested in these really cool programs to kind of remove invasive species from the land. And then on bison is unique to North America. And, the majority of our bison supply is U.S., but we have some Canadian suppliers. And, the bison industry is so tight-knit. Like, it's just the bison industry.
Yeah.
So it's like, is Canada an international supplier? I guess. But, like, and anybody that does bison and to us, like, not really. But technically, there are some animals that are crossing the border there. A very minority of that supply. And then on beef, the majority of our supply comes from the U.S., but we have a good amount of supply that comes from Australia and a very, 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 very small amount in New Zealand. And it's so interesting, the differences in Nuance. I'm so glad that we have that supply structure set up. It's fascinating that how misunderstood these industries are by consumers, because it's like, on one hand, like, I'm an American. I have a grandfather that was shot down over France and another grandfather that was shot in the Battle of Guam. Like, I bleed red, white, and blue. I think all the stuff that's going on from a nationalism perspective is rooted in the right set of values. I'm so proud to be an American, and if I could have everything American sourced, I would. Also, I want to be. I'm sickened by the stat that we eat 87% of the red meat that we do a generation ago, and the reality is we don't produce the amount of meat that we need to satisfy our demand, and we live in a global economy with global supply chains that are necessary. In fact, again, we're about to get into a bunch of nuance, boys. In fact, the herd of beef in the U.S., the amount of we call them animals on the hoof, in the U.S. is as low as it has been in 70 years. So we're at like a generational low in terms of living animals. Meanwhile, we have demand growing. And the reasons are there's been a drought for a few years that sets things back on animals that can live 2 to 3 years. You can imagine the ripple effects that take 5 or more years to work their way through a system. You have interest rates at all-time highs, well, not all-time highs, at extreme highs at the exact wrong time. All these guys are running on credit. They're having to buy animals at prices they've never seen before. Huge risks in that, maybe causing them to exceed their credit lines or whatever. Meanwhile, prices are at an all-time high. People think prices going up 10% or so a year for the last 3 years is crazy. Like, look at the USDA data. The price of a calf doubled in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
So, imagine your raw material cost doubling. What does that mean to the end price? What does it mean to your borrowing base, the animal, and with prices at an all-time high, you have folks kind of reducing herd numbers. They're like, well, I'm going to sell while I'm high instead of holding animals back to maintain the herd. So thank God we have alternatives to supply. Also, what's interesting is while the herd is at a 70-year low and does definitively need to grow for all the reasons I just mentioned domestically, the size of an animal slaughtered in the U.S. has grown 1% a year for each of the last 70 years.
Wow.
So what does that mean? We have like these insanely large animals that are also holding an insane amount of fat. And it turns out the U.S. has an insatiable desire for ground meat and particularly hamburgers. That doesn't actually exist elsewhere in the world. They call it mince and they think it's weird that we eat so much of it. We call it like the foundation of our diet, certainly in this room. And in order to get reasonable ground meat at a fat to lean ratio, say 80-20, 85-15, 90-10, we have to import lean meat because they don't have that same reality that exists. Also, in the case of both New Zealand and Australia in our context, and a lot of meat comes from South America too, in the ruminant side of things. Interesting facts on that. But those economies are like 80% agriculture, and like 80% of agriculture is export. I mean, the entire country of Australia has the population the size of Texas.
I didn't realize that.
But they have a huge amount of supply of beef because they have all of this land and they're their own context. So like, it's funny. I was visiting suppliers in Australia, again, part of our whole initiative, authentic, own relationship, legitimacy, validation. And they were, we were talking about this concept of like rising nationalism in the U.S. and perceptions of international and how we try to think about finding that balance and towing the line. And they're like, yeah, it's interesting. Everybody, like, they love Americans. They love the American market and the consumer. They're proud to be serving Americans. And they're like, honestly, I want American farmers to succeed. I think that we play a role in a healthy system. But like, I feel like I have way more in common. This is an Australian rancher. I feel like I have way more in common with an American rancher than I do with an Aussie living in the city.
Wow.
And I feel like we have the same struggles, and I want to see them succeed. And all of them have been to the U.S. and done and worked on U.S. ranches, and it's so it's like really, really a cool and interesting perspective and community. But I think that that we've done a disservice in some respects with some consumers and kind of villainizing supply that comes from outside the U.S. And I think in some cases those critiques are valid, like on country of origin labeling. If somebody puts product of USA on a package that did not come from the USA, I liken that to stolen valor.
Yeah.
It's a criminal exercise to me. I don't care if it's technically legal. I also don't think that working with international supplies in the way that we are should merit a scarlet letter either. I think that like they're doing incredible things. We have transitioned and brought in certifications and built supply in Australia on hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres and taken huge swaths and major players in the industry and transitioned them to beginning to adjust their practices to serve a market and demand at a global scale that has meaningful impact. Going back to the point on these third-party certifications, right? Like, why do something if it doesn't actually change anything on the land? Well, we're changing things on the land and creating hope and opportunity for farmers. Meanwhile, at a time when costs of U.S. beef are skyrocketing, U.S. beef was really inexpensive in the late teens, and Australia was in a drought, and their beef got really expensive. that tends to operate in offsetting cycles. So we can balance our costs where we can justify bringing on more domestic U.S. producers. We are growing with our U.S. producer base and our U.S. sourcing dramatically because we can offset costs by continuing to work with our foreign partners, even though, again, we're majority U.S. source. So I think that we're able to serve our producer partners by growing in our demand and continuing to allow them opportunities to scale and bringing more folks into a system that gives them access to consumers and stability. Meanwhile, we're also serving consumers by keeping costs in control as these two cycles oscillate. And the value of the dollar in foreign currency translation plays a role. And so it's really, really, really interesting. But I think like for us to serve our mission, we always even going back to our original mission, it's like create a global regenerative supply network. And I think that we're doing that really well while also finding balance in some of these polarizing issues. And I think doing it in a thoughtful and a thoughtful way that I think serves our producers and serves our consumers, and that ultimately we're really proud of to be transparent on this call. And I see you nodding your heads, and I think that when we talk about it, it's like, yeah, that's obvious. That makes a ton of sense. That's how it should be done. And that's if I go back to again my put on my consumer hat, and I'm like, what do I want and expect? It's like, yeah, I want to see people winning in our backyard. And it's like as demand for grass-fed has grown, as whether it's Brazilian or Uruguay, who we don't work with, but they are big grass-fed players in Australia, New Zealand, as supply and demand and importing those has grown. Again, like I said, we've gone from a few hundred to many thousand grass-fed producers in the U.S. So it's like, if you're looking at it from a macro perspective, we're building scale, we're creating supply, we're building awareness, building a consumer base, and ultimately there's a pie chart that represents beef consumption and how it's getting supplied. And my objective is to see the pie grow, but more importantly than that, see the portion of the pie that goes to these good actors grow. Mm-hmm. And that's actively happening. So it tells me that the approach is working.
Yeah, you just talked about supporting good actors. I would love to.
Did that answer your question about what it's like?
Yeah,
sorry.
Absolutely.
I mean, I know
totally.
Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking about what you said about the Cool Act too. I mean, it was repealed 8 years ago? Was it 2016 that it was repealed?
I don't remember the exact date. That sounds about right. But yeah, it was based, I think it was the country of Brazil that somebody sued the U.S.
Yes.
and said, hey, this is creating an unfair competition. And it was really around the labeling part. I mean, I think there's the commonly understood part of that act, and then there's the misunderstood part of that act, which we can get into the nuance if you want.
Yeah, you're just making me think about you're saying that there's so many decisions where you're asking yourself, what do I think the customer wants? And I'm like, well, I think the customer wants transparency. I mean, I would guess 99% of Americans don't even know what the Cool Act is or the fact that it was actually repealed. And imagine we're talking, a lot of this conversation has been around spreading the right education and unveiling the curtain. How would they react knowing that the meat that they think was harvested in the U.S. and these cows are raised in the U.S. are really raised some offshore country overseas, and they're essentially being deceived by the companies that they're buying their meat from.
Well, I think like if that is your value proposition, and there's companies out there that is like that's one of their core premises, then number one, be legitimate. But they're marketing it and they're positioning their product based on it. They're like, we're USA sourced only, USA processed, USA raised, proud American farmers. Like that's amazing. Like great, do that. That's important to you. And so for that consumer, that's a priority. They have that available. That's available to them, and they know who and where they can go to do that. Now, if you're trying to do that and it's illegitimate or in the case fraudulent,
that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then to me that should be prohibited, and I think that's where the overwhelming majority of people would align and agree. I don't think, however, that every single package of meat sold should have the sourcing be required to be disclosed on the front of the package. Not because I don't think that would be interesting, but I think that it would be functionally, logistically, practically punitive. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it actually benefits the consumer. And I think what it ends up happening is you have segregation of supply chain. It's like I could create a package of bison that's like, this product could have come from Canada or could have come from the USA. Like, okay. But like, I don't think it worked that way. I think you had to say where it came from. Like, this came from Canada or this came from the USA. So now I got to go through and segregate and build out systems like, okay, where does it, it doesn't even matter, but I need people and plants and warehousing and SKUs and barcodes and segregation and systems and cost. And I might not be able to fill the orders because I might have only, not enough of each one. I mean, it just gets like, it's so much more complicated than people realize to be able to say specifically where it came down to. And ultimately, it might require ear tagging and RFIDs, which farmers don't really want in America, which are ubiquitous elsewhere for really interesting sets of reasons. And so it's like, I just don't think it's necessary, and I don't think consumers expect everything to come from the U.S. Like, we know most of our fruit and produce is grown abroad, and we know our technology stuff is being manufactured abroad, and it's like, when it's not being manufactured abroad, again, it's like, hey, this is like Teslas are American made. Everybody knows that. That's what's cool about them. That becomes a value proposition that they can anchor into and celebrate, and that's great. But to disrupt supply chains in a way that would, again, not really be meaningful to the majority of consumers, but everything I just described would, again, limit supply and increase cost. Why? I don't think that part of it is what the common consumer would expect. I think it's, again, just don't lie to me and take it. When I want to support American farmers, and you're telling me you're supporting American farmers, don't lie to me.
Yeah.
That's where I think that the majority, and that's the common sense place where this should be focused. But again, there's a lot of other things implied by how that was originally constructed that I think that most folks don't understand.
What's a success look like for you guys in 5 years? Where do you guys want to get to?
I think obviously grow. I mean, look, we have to continue to grow the business in order to drive impact, and in order to substantiate an economic and financial business model that is worthy of replication. We can't be like a not-for-profit and make the case that this is where the industry needs to go. It's like again, from a people, planet, and profit perspective, we need to exceed on all measures in order to get the attention of the majority of the industry and the incumbency to say, hey, there's incentive here worth replicating what we're doing, and we can serve consumers and do it in a way that is financially and economically justified. I think, more specifically, obviously we're getting more and more involved in traditional proteins like beef and poultry. So I think having a much bigger role in participation and driving change in those industries, where, kind of like you guys have said, there's more regenerative players. We were talking about regenerative when nobody was talking about regenerative, and now there's more. So great. Like, I'd like to see more people talking about some of the stuff we talked about on this call, and as it relates to poultry or beef or otherwise. And so hopefully we have more of a position in those industries, which has generated more of a ripple effect where other people have more position in those industries that I would call good actors and allies, and where consumers are more aware of issues and doing a better job of advocating for themselves and sending demand signals that justify for folks on the other end of the supply chain to make changes that everybody can be proud of. I think even more specifically, it probably means us going from, where we were a few years ago, predominantly incremental stuff like ancestrals and exotics and natural channel, to, again, more traditional stuff and more conventional channels, having engaged with and built loyalty and following and support from the early adopters and the mavens, and found ways to, to your point on like, how do you just through messaging and content, you have to reach people. It's having, finding ways to reach more of the conventional shopper with messages that are appropriate for them, and having our product distributed in ways that are more accessible for them. So that, again, that we can continue to serve consumers, and then continue to drive scale and expand and serve the mission. And again, if we achieve that with those consumers in those channels, then others, once again, can follow, and the size of the pie for all of the good actors grows. I hope that at some point we like, again, where our specialization is, and like our sweet spot is, I think the storytelling and engaging and messaging and marketing and aggregation and focus on the consumer. I hope in 5 years from now we will have built some ability to influence and built relationships and the opportunity to influence some regulation and get to stuff on the USDA, the Farm Bill, the politics, that kind of stuff. I think there's opportunity for change there. It hasn't been the focus because I don't know. I have no experience with it,
Yeah.
and so, I'm focusing on driving. I'm focusing on demand creation and building a system to supply some of the demand I hope that we're creating. And I think in the future we can, hopefully influence the policy that can continue to help give more reward and credit and justification for the change that we want to see from a mission perspective as well.
Yeah, it's probably pretty amazing to think about just how much the movement has progressed since 2019. Do you ever think about just the faith that you guys had? Just like you guys really hugged the cactus to start this company, to like build a regenerative supply chain from scratch, especially in 2019. Like no one was barely anyone was talking about seed oils and vegetable oil consumption in the big four packers. At least from my perspective, I was barely even in the weeds on it back then. I was just starting to go carnivore and experiment with my macronutrients, but I didn't know any of this stuff back then. And I feel like I was like a 1%er. So I don't know. I just maybe more of a comment just around like the courage that you guys had and like the right bet to make, thinking about where things are in 2025 now.
Sorry, just one quick fun tangent because I know you guys amongst will appreciate this more than anybody. I was touring a slaughter facility recently, and there's a section of the plant where they have all of this industrial machine equipment, and at the base of this area of the facility, they had all of these like pony keg size canisters, and I went and looked at them, and it was all canola oil, and it was the lubricant for all of the machines.
There you go.
Awesome.
You're seeing it in action.
This was a big plant too. This was not like these people being scrappy and thinking outside the box. This is just like just what we know. It is machine. It is industrial machine lubricant.
Yes.
It's just labeled as canola oil. It was just funny because it looked like it could have just been at a
Walmart,
at like a bulk supply retailer or something, like huge tubs of probably in every kitchen in America, or most of them. A commercial kitchen. Dude, it's crazy. Like I think we're now something like working with over 400 different unique farms and ranches who are employing over 2,000 individual people and impacting over 3 million acres of land across the proteins, across the supply network. The overwhelming majority of that being, in the USA, which we wouldn't be working with international suppliers if it wasn't providing the opportunity to do that very thing and grow in the USA. And again, just to think like to take a step out from our business and its direct impact and look at the some of the indirect impact or things that are going on. Like I said, back in 2011 or 2012 when we started talking about regenerative and nobody knew what it was, to seeing it being talked about by political candidates and on mainstream news outlets, and some of the issues that we feel like we've been screaming, getting on a soapbox and screaming on deaf ears, now being mainstream concepts about how to improve health and wellness, and how our food systems are a major component of improving health and wellness, and how that then supports the very underlying things that we're trying to do as a driving factor, and how consumers are rallying around that. And you're seeing continued positive trends and support and advocacy suggesting that yes, these things are delivering on their desires and are resonating with them. So like you're hitting it at all levels and all angles, and it's like, man, the environment just seems to get continually more challenging to operate in, but also all of the key ingredients you want there to suggest that things are going well and it's in the right direction, and hope is and confidence should be growing and increasing, are also represented by, the change that we've seen, not just since Force of Nature in 2019 or since our last conversation 3 years ago, but since we started on this journey now close to 15 years ago, when like nobody knew what we were talking about.
Yeah. Are you just looking at like from a policy standpoint, like there's so much money that goes into farming and ag, but it feels like regenerative capture such a small portion of that. I'd be curious to just get your take on, like, do you think that people empower people who are being elected into government are thinking about, how can we get dollars into the hands of suppliers and people who are actually doing the work here in the U.S. It's the industry is just so interesting, even from just looking at like the schools out there. Like a lot of the schooling is around, how to use chemicals, not how to work the land. So I'm like, will more dollars be poured into, whether it's subsidies or, programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the land grant universities and who's subsidizing the dollars, and therefore who has influence over the curriculum, and the farm bill itself and the incentives that it creates, and who has the most aligned base to support the lobbyists and the most dollars to support the influence that drives policy in Washington, and all of those things. I think that, again, this is not my arena, but I definitely see momentum mounting where I think that, while nothing will be perfect, I think that a playing field can be leveled. I think it may not necessarily maybe more dollars available to getting farmers on the land so that we can, return and increase the amount of farming and ranching we do domestically, which I do think that we need to do. And I think particularly ensuring that as farms turn over, it lands in the hands of people, not hedge funds, and that the people that really want to be on the land and working, and that they have access, because the cost of land and interest rates and all these things make that really difficult. And I think the subsidies that make doing it really big and at scale, and that unfairly cheapen food, in some cases offer less than the cost of production, I think that can be affected, where the playing field is a little more leveled for the folks that aren't getting the benefit of those subsidies. So even maybe not, in some cases it's the presence of rewards, and in some cases it's the absence of rewarding the for lack of a better term, evil alternative.
Yeah.
And then again, I just think like the fact that folks are talking about it therefore drives some ownership and accountability, and even just what's going on with food dyes. You know what I mean? Like, I think some of us might take the perspective that it's not enough, but I think the recognition of like, man, this has been going on for decades and it's important, and it's a starting point. It creates momentum, and momentum is a very powerful force at that sort of scale, and it's the first in a series of dominoes. But that somehow you always got to figure out how to get that first one over.
Yes.
And so I think making sure that we don't, again, villainize all of the imperfections of everybody and fail to celebrate progress when it's made. I think like recognizing the value and stopping to smell the roses of progress, and then putting our heads back down and going back to work to continue to raise the bar, but not undercutting our own very efforts whenever all of our preferences aren't realized simultaneously.
Yeah.
I think that'll go a long way to, continuing to give consumers a voice, and giving and ensuring that voice is met or heard by people with the influence to drive change at a policy and regulatory level. Again, the challenge with these big, complex systems like the U.S. government is the checks and balances and the segregation of departments and agencies, and the health sector is not related to the agriculture sector, and so like there has to be some level of collaboration, and that's good and bad, and in a variety of ways. But I think with patience, we can see where things are headed, and if we can take a political lens and stop worrying about R's versus D's versus whatever gang or affiliation you have, and focus on like, hey, what's in the best interest of people and my neighbor, regardless of where we agree and disagree. I want to see life expectancy and health span increasing, and I want to see kids doing well, and I want to see more people enjoying and thriving. And I hope we can find some way to align, regardless of affiliation, on those as key criteria, and not making it so polarizing and whatever. And again, I think that I have a lot of hope, and I see a lot of progress and momentum being built there, and that gets me pretty darn excited.
That's awesome, man. What's the best way, Robby, for people just to connect with you and just all the work that you guys are doing in Force of Nature?
Well, I'd say, we do have that podcast we talked about, Where Hope Grows. We don't release a lot of episodes, but I think that we have a few really interesting episodes to point back to on this one. So I'd go check out, a few years ago, we launched a podcast called The Truth About Chicken, and this week we launched another one. It's kind of like our follow-up to what's going on with chicken, and we go in great detail about that. But we have a blog, and I think we're doing some really interesting stuff on testing. We're spending a lot of money testing everything that we do over a period of time for micronutrients, macronutrients, phytochemical compounds, fatty acid composition, amino acid composition, bioactive compounds like CoQ10 and creatine and taurine, and all of these really cool things that are being talked about, and just trying to understand how do we crack the code and sort of open source the conversation for farmers and ranchers to talk about not just meat as superior, but these versions of meat as superior. Our initial data samples are insane. Like, our supply chain is exceeding the standard for meat on really critical and essential nutrients and minerals and fatty acid profiles. And anyway, it's pretty exciting stuff.
Wow.
It's too early to really pronounce definitively, but certainly really important results. And also within all of that testing, we're testing for agriculture chemical residues.
Dang. All right, this is gonna be our topic for podcast number 3.
Oh yeah, yeah. So it's
2 years
like,
from now.
and by the way, all of our tests are not showing levels of agriculture chemical residues that would be of any level of concern. And so it's like, again, no credit given for that, but it's the right thing to do to make sure that are we getting the right outcomes out of what we're doing. So really exciting stuff there. But we are going to be writing blogs about this. And so long way to get to that point. Our website, we're building out and slowly adding to this, what is the Force of Nature standard, and then the Transparency Initiative that sort of translates our protocols and our standard to maybe familiar proof points like I described. How do we stack up against certain welfare certifications or organic or whatever? So you can find that kind of stuff on our website. Post a lot of content on Instagram. We're starting to do more and more videos on YouTube and some of the common social channels. So, at Force of Nature Meats on Instagram. Forceofnature.com is our website and where we do blog. I think our email is pretty great. I think a lot of emails out there are just selling at you.
100%. You guys, your email's very different.
And I hope that we're not selling at you. I hope we're unapologetically letting you know we have things you can buy, but I hope that we're actually raising awareness and connecting you to issues that are important to you and helping you better advocate for yourself and make sure that the system you're supporting is the one that really does align with your values, regardless of how the package might be designed to deceive you. Maybe start there.
Yeah.
Love it.
Do you guys have a retail tracker for people that want to buy the chicken too? Can they find a retail store on the website?
Yeah. So we have on our website, we actually sell direct to consumer. And so you can order stuff that we make. And then, at the bottom of the webpage, you can go down to a retail tracker and it'll tell you exactly what products we have in retail. And I think we have, I don't even know, 40,000 something distribution points. So we have a lot of stuff available in every state and a lot of different types of products. And definitely want you to support our retail partners because they're the ones taking a leap of faith on us that these crazy things that we're trying to do and disrupt are meaningful to consumers. So check us out there on where to get the products and we'll continue to do farmer highlights too. And like I said, videos and blogs and content and try to let folks know where there's people that we're actively working with that if you have access to their products, just go buy from them.
Yeah.
Well, Robby, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate you joining us for part 2. We'll link to all that stuff in the show notes, but thanks again. And thank you guys for so much, everything that you guys are doing, just paving the way. I feel like you guys probably don't get nearly enough credit for just the risks that you guys are taking and the boldness that it takes to make some of these changes happen. And it's inspiring. I feel like brands, we need more brands like Force of Nature. We need more brands who are doing things the right way. So appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks a bunch. Sorry for all the rambling. Hopefully, though, because it was
No,
round
nuance.
2, the nuance,
baby.
Hopefully, I made those points as succinctly as I'm able to. So
No, it's great. That's what our audience wants, man. So thank you so much.
cool. Thank you both. Appreciate that.
Thanks, man.